Hey folks, welcome back to Demystify Sci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
Today we are looking at a really good introductory work to Carl Jung. It is called The Undiscovered Self. And Jung can be quite impenetrable, and often, just like Chomsky, he tries to take this very unimpassioned approach to prose in order to convey information as much as possible without getting the passions worked up. This is a really good starting place because it really unfurls this entire philosophical approach to the universe and talks about this idea that instead of trying to solve the world by changing how everybody else thinks, a really good place to start is by looking inside of yourself and at your own relationship to your work, to your relationships with other people, and generally at the not so good parts of yourself, which he calls the shadow. Now, this book in particular seems really relevant to us right now because it's a thorough critique of the increasing bureaucratization of society, and he's writing it right around the birth of the Cold War, but after World War II, and in many senses he looks at the archetypical bureaucratic state as the Soviet Union. And so, of course, Solzhenitsyn has just published his tome relating the horrors of the Soviet bureaucracy and what that actually means for the common person, people stuck in these gulags. And in some sense, he's responding to this Soviet scientificization of society, this idea that you can treat people as data points and engineer the optimal society as the result of it. He's responding to that on the absolute abysmal horror that results in the individual's life as the result of that. And of course, there's nonstop parallels to what's happening in our modern society with the totalitarian of the techno-bureaucratic industrial complexes that are swallowing our state infrastructure, our state institutions, our academic institutions. And we wanted to tear apart this book a little bit and see what parts of Jung's analysis, with respect to the crises of his time back in the 50s, still relate to our present situation as we see it unfolding today. And so we find some parallels, we find some differences, and we try to make a game plan for what we can all be doing to resist what we see as a potentially not existential threat, but certainly a civilization level threat. And at the end of the day, we really enjoy the Western world. We really like the luxuries and conveniences that are afforded to us by this modern civilization, and we'd like to see it work out in the future. And that's ultimately what our conversation is in service of. You know, this isn't an anarchistic scree about how we need to tear everything down. This is a attempt to understand how we can get it working better for us as human beings, not just as numbers on a page.
That's really well said. I don't actually think I can add anything to that. I think it was a really good conversation. I really like being able to sit down with you and deal with these things. It's conversations that each of us are thinking about in the backs of our minds, and we haven't actually sat down to really clearly lay it out. And so it's cool to have a piece of writing that gives us the opportunity to just react to it in our own personal ways. And I think over the course of the conversation, it comes out that we kind of think about it slightly differently, but we also align in some places. And so
a lot of it's learning how to talk too, right? Like the reason I love conversations, podcasting, but also just talking with you just in our daily lives is because oftentimes I think that I think one thing, but then when I talk with somebody, I realize, that's not quite exactly what I think. I've been sort of hamstrung by the language that I was using, and I'm missing something.
I actually also like the rhetorical tool of saying the most extreme possible version of something and then having the person be like, wait a second, you sure that that's what you mean? And then having to actually take it apart and walk it back and shave it into something that looks much closer to what the actual intention is.
And this is the wonderful thing about having a conversation with a friend, is that I trust that no matter what idiotic junk flies out of my mouth, that you will help me get back on course without getting up and leaving. And oftentimes when we're dealing with, new acquaintances on the podcast, I feel a little bit ginger about where I step with my ideas because I don't want this person to get the wrong idea. And it's not so much that I'm self-censoring as that I'm trying to
Just
get
trying to make
somewhere
a pleasant experience.
in
You
order
don't
to
want
get somewhere.
Yeah, like you don't want the person to freak out, and so you have to be careful. This definition of friendship has newly come into my life after this last guiding trip. One of the guides mentioned it to me, and I think that it really is a central piece to the puzzle, because it's like you want to be surrounded by people with whom you can talk about ideas and have nobody freak out. And that's what we're after here more than anything else. And so when we have these solo conversations, it's you and me talking about stuff that we've not explicitly talked about before and trying to figure out what it is that we have to say about it and trying to tighten our own understanding of ourselves and of each other. And hopefully it helps the audience as well, because, I mean, we don't spend a lot of time looking at the audience during these conversations, but it's hard to imagine us sitting down and recording these conversations was there not an audience present.
Yeah, so thanks for the opportunity, guys, for hanging out and supporting us and making sure we can continue to do these. And I hope we'll be doing more of these solo conversations. I really love them. It seems like y'all are enjoying them for the most part. And so hopefully we'll be shuffling those more and more into what we do here at the podcast. And it's a great opportunity for us to be able to actually read a book and make something of it, and be able to carve off the time for that. So,
I'm sorry, I'm yawning. I slept 12 hours last night, and even after sleeping for 12 hours, I'm still like ready to go back to bed. So I did this, I just came back from this Grand Canyon trip, and so it was 5 days of, 3 a.m. wake up calls, midnight go to sleeps, and I'm just totally rocked. And so I appreciate you going slow with me during this conversation, because I feel like I was only firing on half cylinders.
I'm completely amped up because I got to go and give an hour and a half lecture at the university after this. So I'm halfway through my my mountain.
I feel like a hibernating bear. I'm like,
Anyways, remember, guys, we couldn't do this without our patrons. I really don't even know how to say thank you enough. It's really powerful for me to go out into the world and say that this project is entirely funded by you guys and that you make this possible. We don't have to sell anything. We don't have any ads other than the ones maybe YouTube or Spotify is just automatically slapping on everything. So we're going to keep it that way. You guys are going to help us. And the more of you that come over and give us the tiniest bit of money or a huge wheelbarrow full of money, it all goes towards making sure that we can put more and more of our time into these analyses and these conversations. And
I think that it is hard to overstate, like Shiloh said, how grateful we are, but also how much the tiniest donation can help us. If you give us $1 a month, that might not seem like a lot, but if there are 1,000 people that give $1 a month, all of a sudden we're starting to move towards something significant. If 10,000 people give us $1 a month, that means that we can record these conversations in person. It means that we can buy better equipment. It means that we can throw more conferences. It means that we can put more funds towards all of the things that we want to be able to do with this project, which right now we're sort of like, well, we have to pick and choose here and there funds are limited. But really, there's I'm gonna diverge. This hike in the Grand Canyon is like a fundraising hike, right? So a lot of the people who are involved in it have multiple sclerosis or know somebody or have cancer or know somebody who's died of cancer. And so everybody goes and collects money from their networks, and that money at the end of the trip is donated to a laboratory so that they can start a project that is not funded through a large grant agency. It was a very cool project.
In other words, they can do research that's not government funded, so it can go outside the Overton window of what government money should be going towards, which is generally pharmaceutical interests.
Thank you for translating it into podcast. I think that was well said. But one of the days, so I came out of the canyon, and Grafton, one of the girls who ran the canyon this year, is standing on the rim, and she's wearing a mosquito hat. It's just this like weird hat that has mosquito on it. And I was like, Grafton, what are you wearing? She's like, well, when I collect donations, I always tell people who are like, well, I can't really make that much of a difference because I only have a couple dollars. She's like, well, just think about the kind of difference that a single mosquito makes in your room at night when you're trying to sleep, which goes to show that even the tiniest little creature can move the world, whether you like it or not. And so if you have $1 a month that you can give us, it would help immensely, because the tiniest quantity from a lot of people means that we have a tremendous amount of motive power in our sales, and that lets us get much farther. And we love to see you at Patron Chat. We love to be able to see you at our conferences. We love to be able to provide more and more stuff for you. And the only way that we can do that is if we can either A, clone ourselves, or B, have the money to hire some more people who can help us with this project. Shout out to Matthew, who's our newest guy who's helping us with the project. But we'd really like to be able to pay him more and pay him better so that he can help us out even more.
Yeah, and honestly, that's just going to go towards ultimately making sure we have more time to do our job, which is get prepped for these conversations, do the reading we need to do, watch the documentaries we need to do, and bring you guys better and better conversations. Plus, it's just so freaking cool that we're doing something here that is outside of these traditional superstructures, right? We're not depending on that typical industrial road plan for how you succeed in the world. And so you can be a part of that. And it'll mean so much to me, but I think it means a lot to everybody who sees this program and realizes that it's entirely paid for by listeners. It's pretty badass.
Indeed. All right. Well, I think that covers everything. Like, subscribe, comment, Twitter, Facebook, Discord, t-shirts down below. We will see you next time. Enjoy our conversation about Carl Jung. Thank you very much to everybody.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Undiscovered Self podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
I know this isn't what we're going to talk about today, but I am curious why you think that the proliferation of the tech boom and all this wealth flooding in has resulted in so much poverty at the same time.
Guilt, probably.
Explain that.
Well, okay, so you have people that have lots of money and they look around and they believe in doing good with their money. And there's other people around who are like, well, if you give us money, we'll take care of the destitute. And then they dump money into taking care of the destitute.
And the bureaucracy mismanages the money.
And the bureaucracy just eats the money and they're like, whoops, we have way more homeless people than we did
We need
before.
more money.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's just this, because who's checking? Like, it was crazy because I think that, oh, this is really far away. Hold on. One of the last things that we did before we left on this big long trip was we played a show in San Francisco. And it was a house show, so we were hanging out with people that actually lived in the city and worked in the city. And so we were all these kind of like artist kids and various idealists, I would say. And one of them he was working at both a hotel kitchen and a homeless shelter.
And he was working for Clear Channel.
Yeah, so he was going to all these concerts. So he had this swath of experiences. And he started working at the homeless shelter because of idealistic motivations. He wanted to help the homeless. And very quickly he realized how fucked it was. He was like, this is not a thing. These are not people that A, want your help, or B, are innocently in this position. These are people who are angry and want a place to do drugs.
And even worse, I think he had concluded that the state had essentially, through these shell companies, these NGOs, had delegated the task not of really helping people, but of getting them off the street. So basically funneling them. So it used to be that homeless shelters in general, you know, I used to talk to a lot of homeless people when I first moved to San Francisco. I actually made it a policy of just talking to anybody who would come up to me on the street. And I didn't have a car when I first moved there. So I spent a lot of time walking around in Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco, and I would just talk to everybody. And it used to be that homeless shelters were really militant about not allowing drugs inside. And right, you basically had to leave in the morning. You couldn't just live there. You could come in at night, and then you couldn't, you know, set up camp basically. But this person that we were talking with at the show, who lives at that warehouse, he was saying that all of that's gone out the window, and that at this point, people don't get their bags searched or anything. It's just a place to get these people out of sight. So they bring their drugs in, they bring
I was really amused by the fact that you're allowed to bring drugs in, but you're not allowed to bring food in.
Because the cockroaches eat
Because
the food, not the drugs.
yeah, exactly.
But it seemed like he was just borderline cracking over this experience and trying to find his way out because he felt completely powerless to execute his mission, which was to help people. And he felt completely disconnected from the bureaucratic structure above him. And when we suggested, have you tried to talk to your bosses about this and stuff, he kind of rolled his eyes like it was a hopeless endeavor.
Well, what's he going to say to them?
And what power did they have? These policies seem to be coming down from far, far many abstracted levels above them, right? The mission has, whatever it's called, the shelter has been set up with the goal of getting people off of the street at all costs, not with the goal of rehabilitating people or orienting them towards a better future for themselves. It's literally just to get them out of sight. Because it's funny, I noticed this over, I don't remember, the last year or something. We went and played some shows in San Francisco. It was pretty gnarly. And then we came back right after, I think after Gavin Newsom had invited some Chinese diplomats, and he completely cleared out all of the homeless camps, right? Because I remember we went to that climbing gym in the Mission, and it was just gnar the first time. And then we came back, and it was just completely cleaned out. And we're like, wow, that's interesting. I mean, wonder what happened to all those people. And it's like, oh, okay, well, they just corralled them out of sight down in South San Francisco or wherever.
I think they bus them places too. We had a really funny experience when we were in Los Angeles. We were coming back to the airport and had an Uber driver who made an unbelievable claim. She said that 60% of Los Angeles population was homeless. This is not true. I was like, I tried to double check to make sure she actually intended that, and she said yes multiple times.
I think she said 75. I remember being like, I think that would be a little more obvious.
It was funny too because we were driving through a residential neighborhood, and it was clear that the apartments were all filled, but there was nobody on the streets, and I was like, But she said something else, which I know is a practice, which is that cities bus people out.
Yeah.
They just give them bus tickets. And they're like, you can do whatever you want. You can't stay here. Get out. And so they basically just send them wherever.
Somebody else's problem.
Right. And so who knows what they did with the homeless people. But clearly, when there is a will, there is a way. There just isn't a will for normal people. There's only a will for foreign diplomats so that aesthetics can be maintained at all costs, that, everything's good here. Land of milk and honey.
Yeah, and I feel like I don't want to name this guy, but I feel like his experience was emblematic of something that most of us experience in these giant organizations, which is...
the death of idealism?
I mean, in some sense, you're attracted to different professions. We have a lot of friends who are doctors as well. And you're attracted to these professions for very noble reasons. I actually, when I was a kid, I thought maybe I'd want to be a doctor too, because it seemed really cool. Somebody comes in, they're messed up, and you put them back together. It's like, that seems like a really cool life. And by the way, they seem to occupy some sort of noble status in society, in my childhood mind, as a direct result of the fact that they're doing such obvious, concrete, good work, right? And they're rewarded for with status and, with some degree of stability financially.
I never wanted to be a doctor, but later in life, I discovered I really enjoyed doing surgery on people.
Yes, you do like to do surgery. You just did some nice surgery on my foot yesterday, as a matter of fact, thanks to the stabby things in our yard.
Yeah.
But it's really sad because almost everyone I know who's a doctor now, which is a few people that I came up through the academy with, they're pretty depressed about the state of their ability to actually heal people.
I had a doctor at one of the biggest institutions in the United States tell me that he was not allowed by the lawyers to tell people, I'm sorry for the diagnosis that you have received. I'm sorry for your pain, because the lawyers are like, that's admitting guilt, and you can't do that. And so he has to send out these horrific test results to people that are getting diagnosed with life-changing illnesses and cannot say anything to offer any kind of succor to them.
Right. So, in this book, I actually don't know if it's from the Jung book, I don't
Or
even
can
know.
we tell people what book?
Yeah, so we were going to, well, we can tell them in the intro, but, we're going to be talking about this
I
book.
feel like people probably skip the intro sometimes.
Go ahead.
I don't actually know what it's called. Go ahead. Are you saying go ahead to the people who skip the intros? Go ahead, skip the intros. See what that gets you. I won't tell you the
book's
book.
called the Undiscovered Self. And at some point...
Carl Jung?
It's a Jung book, yeah. And actually, I read a bunch of different things getting ready for this, so I'm getting them confused. But I read this, I read Kierkegaard, a little bit of a Kierkegaard book, and I read a little bit of Nietzsche. And there's this idea embedded, and I believe it's in the Jung book, that laws become substitutes for actual moral decision-making at some points, right? So in order to offshore your thinking, you start to depend more and more on these rules and regulations as a direct result of that. So in this case, the laws come in to the medical profession and they start saying, hey, it's better if we don't actually say something like that because then people will think that we did it, which is interesting.
But the doctor doesn't buy it. Nobody buys it. It's just literally there's a large system that is pressing down on you that you must obey. And I think that this is like rule of law versus rule by law, which I think is a dichotomy that exists where rule of law is that everybody has a strong internalized sense of what is right and wrong, and so behave that way. Rule by law is that there's a large superstructure that says this is right, this is wrong, and you will obey. And so that seems like, I could be totally wrong about rule of law and rule by law, but that seems like what it is. What's happening in this case?
Well, it's interesting because you say the doctors don't really consent to this, but the fact of the matter is...
No, he's like, I tell people. Like, I won't write it down.
Off record.
Where the lawyers can see it, I won't write it down, but I'll tell people.
Yeah. Well, right on. And I think most of the doctors I know too go out of their way, but I think it pains them greatly that they're so hobbled by, in this case, the bureaucracy's legalese and legalism, that they have a difficult time actually doing their job, which is trying to help people get healthy. Ultimately, that's certainly why people go into medicine. I don't know anybody who went into medicine for any other reason.
Other than idealistic searching for being able to do something good for the world. Yeah? Hard to argue with. And so I think that the conversation that we wanted to have today is to kind of discuss the ways in which idealism seems to have failed so many people over the course of the last generation and a half, where everybody has started to participate in progressively larger and larger systems. The systems have a different set of organizing principles than you would expect and hope that systems with the desire to improve human life would have. It's a very complicated way of saying that they seem to work orthogonally to human flourishing. And nobody really knows what to do about this. And so Jung wrote this book, The Undiscovered Self, where he's basically saying, look, this is, and he wrote it in the 50s. And so he's basically saying that this is a thing that has always happened. When this starts to happen and people buy into it, everything starts to fall apart very, very quickly. And there's only one thing that can keep it from happening. And I don't want to drop that one thing yet. Maybe we can talk about his argument, and then by the end of the conversation, get to the one thing that he says will keep it from happening.
Yeah, I think we should make his case first. Most of the book, well, at least the first half of the book, seems to deal with what is happening in society. And it's funny because he's writing this book in 1957. And so his argument is actually not turned too much towards the West. He's actually using the decay of the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union and what happened. Obviously, Solzhenitsyn brought this horror to light for the West for the first time. And so he uses that as a template for what happens when the state becomes totalizing and becomes the center of everybody's lives. And I think he has a suspicious eye towards the West for the potential for that to develop elsewhere. But it's not I think that whether or not he foresaw what's happening in our own country with our own government and these tendencies and this bureaucratic totalization is up to interpretation. But, it really, for me, one of the big questions I had was how much of the totalitarianism that threatens our own civilization right now here in America, let's say, but honestly, probably in Europe as well, how much of that is reflective of what happened in the Soviet Union and how much of it is something completely different and new, right? Because to the extent that we read into Jung's analysis of the Soviet Union in our own lives, is that a congruence analysis, or are there pieces that he couldn't have foreseen?
Well, it's like you always run into a danger where you look at a certain situation and you try to say that it looks exactly the same as another situation that has already happened in the past. And I find this deeply unsatisfying because you look at all of the problems that we have today, and none of those problems seem exactly the same as during the Industrial Revolution, or at the time of the Reformation, or at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. But it's very easy to try to bin the things that are happening now and say, see, history is a cycle that repeats endlessly, and here we are again on the cusp of yet another collapse, and it has all of the characteristics of previous collapses. And I'm like, I'm not sure that is true. Like, I don't know if it's really possible to have a cohesive, cogent theory of collapse that you can say that each and every collapse that happens for these same reasons, and look, you can map all of history onto these things. Like, I'm sure that you can do that to some extent by just taking a hammer and kind of forcing things into certain holes, but
that's the easiest way to do it. So it might be fun as we go through some of the quotes from this book to think about the ways in which it's playing out slightly differently in our society today. I mean, the most obvious one is that I don't think that anybody who's concerned about the fate of our civilization sees it turning into gulags and turning into gas chambers and things like this.
I think there are people who are afraid of that.
There might be a few on the fringe, but it's a much more quiet oppression. The totalization of the bureaucratic state in the modern age is a much more subtle beast, right? It's more about people being cut off from one another, about their voices being choked out, about people having the inability to form community with really to form communities that aren't centered around some controllable narrative, right? So what are the communities that are supported by the industrial media organizations like Facebook, YouTube? Well, as long as you can fall into a right or left camp, they'll promote your stuff, because that's a really controllable situation. You have people who are pointing at the other side and saying that the other side of the monster is the problem, but at the end of the day, sure, the monster hates its other half, but it's still being promoted. The monster is still being promoted. So that lack of nuance, the lack of subtlety, the lack of the center, and this is something that the Russian historian we were listening to on Lex was talking about too.
Sergei Plotsky.
Was that, it's often thought that the collapse of the Soviet Union came down to this impossible, ideology that was opposed to human nature. And he was saying that a huge part of it was actually the collapse of the center. So there's radicals on both sides. They get all of the microphones, and you don't actually have a voice. You don't have a place for people to accumulate in that actual reasoned, nuanced center space.
I got the feeling that he was actually talking about the physical center, because he made this case that Moscow and Vladivostok were in the same country, and then Ukraine defected. They left the Soviet Union and voted to leave. And that literally is the center of the country.
I think you might be right, but I took it very differently. It made me think about how orphaned I feel. We've talked about this on previous conversations, so I won't repeat myself, but I think this is a pretty common experience, is that one finds themselves not having a home on either one of the arms of the monster. And that can be a very lonely place because you want to be able to connect with people, but in terms of mass media, which is really YouTube and Facebook and Instagram, the real connections occur at either radicalized arm of the extreme. That's where you can actually find a big pool of people. And so, yeah, you have to basically prune away your beliefs. Depending on what pisses you off the most, maybe you'll find a home on one side or the other. If you've got, Trump derangement syndrome and you're completely freaked out about this disgusting person who's at the head of the country or potentially at the head of the country, maybe you take that as your highest value and you find yourself in the arm of the monster that's opposed to Trump. And you might not agree with a lot of the stuff that those people are into, but you say, I don't have to really, I'll leave it alone. I'll fall into line on those things because I'm so passionate about how despicable this Trump guy is. Likewise, people who might have a more nuanced perspective on various issues, liberalized issues, could be so alienated by the bureaucratic takeover and so forth that they see Trump as this savior character who's outside of the system, and they're willing to overlook the fact that he's a despicable character because, well, at least he's not part of the goon squad that's been lying to us for so many years. And
to those people, I'd like to remind them that he did say he'd drain the swamp, and that has not been mentioned since roughly, I don't know, the early 2010s at this point.
I mean, I don't want to defend the guy, but I think that the president has far less power than they think they do when they're campaigning.
I think that the swamp is I think that what happens is that you realize that the swamp is absolutely necessary. You can't drain the swamp because because you're all swamp creatures and you need the swamp. And if you drain the swamp, you die. And you can't possibly fill the swamp with people because nobody actually wants that responsibility. The swamp creatures are the only ones that want to live there and do their thing, and they have all the networks, and so you actually can't do anything about it. And so it's
and the whole system is so thoroughly captured and corrupt at this point that who do you think's paying for your White House in the first place? Who's paying for everything? It's like
I don't really. Actually, let me start that sentence differently. I think that Brett Weinstein's experience has been really illustrative of just how much there is a single monster that can be interacted with, which is that a couple years ago, he came up with this idea for the Unity Party, which I thought was really interesting. So you had the president is the person who gets voted for, who gets the most votes, and then the vice president is the candidate that gets the second most.
By the way, he didn't come up with that. That was the original plan for the country, and that's the way it worked for a while.
Or hold on, no. His thing is he came up with that's totally wrong. Sorry, you're right.
Which is a cool idea, by the way. I love that idea. I don't know how it disappeared.
I don't mean to slander. I think that it disappeared because these people can't work with each other. His idea was to take a cross-party ticket. He had Andrew Yang and some general for the right. And so basically running somebody who had a centrist Democratic perspective and a centrist Republican perspective, putting them on the same ticket and allowing them to go out into the world and see if they could recruit people to their vote. And it got censored everywhere. You couldn't post it.
They threw it off Twitter, right?
They threw it off Twitter. They threw it off Facebook. It was a whole thing. And then you were telling me that he got together with a bunch of people and organized some rally in DC the other day.
Yeah, it was Save the Republic or something like that.
But it's not. It doesn't exist. It's not in the news. It's not anywhere. I don't know what happened to it. I don't know why people are. Nobody's talking about it, which is really.
I can't even find it on Google. It's hilarious. Save the Republic. He had a manifesto.
I'm sure that he did have a manifesto, but my point is that these things are
Save Our Republic.
Are completely buried and hidden, and the whole point is to make sure that the monster, which is these two parties, survives, because as soon as you have a third pole that shows up and says, hey, I think that both of these are screwed up, then both of them lose power. And so it's the enemy of my enemy is my friend is at work here a little bit, but it's in this sense, it's the enemy of my enemy is also my enemy because that person actually wants to get rid of both of us. And so...
Wait, this isn't it. Never mind. I'm sorry. God damn it. This is like some anti-Trump stuff. God, what a nightmare.
Okay, well, so Brett Weinstein's project cannot be found, which goes to show that his entire point about this is that Jill Stein.
I have no idea.
that's Jill
This is
Stein.
Hilarious. I'm really sorry, Brett.
But this goes to show that there's somebody who's trying to organize something that is a viable third alternative that probably is not very pro tech parties and is erased completely. And that's very scary because on one hand, like, okay.
Rescue the Republic.
Rescue the Republic.
Good God. It's so funny that there's just all these like troll websites that show up on Google that have nothing to do with it.
Well, if you're not searching for the right thing, like it's hard to find.
This was Tulsi, Russell Brand, Brett Weinstein, a bunch of people.
What a crew.
Rescue the Republic. I want to see if I can pull up their tenets.
But so I'm like, look, we live in a time of high centralization. And anybody who's coming around and is like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be so centralized. Maybe we shouldn't have such strong poles of power that are ruled by people that are not at all affected by democratic structures. Maybe we shouldn't do that. Anybody who comes around to say that is immediately dismissed and thrown out. And it's like, it's really funny because we were listening to Shoshana Zuboff on Econ Talk last night. And she's a character. Clearly somebody who has spent a lot of time lecturing and very little time conversing, which makes sense also with the fact that her book is it's basically the Das Kapital of the surveillance century. And she's trying to make this case to Russ about the fact that the algorithms are bad and these corporations are bad and we should be afraid of what these tech companies are doing. And Russ is doing a really good job of being like, well, they sell us stuff that we want. Like, why is that bad? They make my life easier. Isn't this good? My life is a lot more productive because they sell me things that actually improve my quality of life as opposed to selling me things that I don't want. And I was really shocked that Shoshana didn't take the opportunity. She kind of got there. She was like, well, they have the ability to start to manipulate people in the real world. Like they have metrics for click-through rate, which they've been maintaining for decades now. They're like, the things that have a high click-through rate are the things that we can put good advertisements on, and so these are the things that will promote to the top of the stack. Okay, great. The next level is meat space manipulation. And so she went on this entire rant about Pokemon Go, which was produced by a company called Niantic Labs, which turns out to have been a CIA Google project to pilot a test to see if they could get people to go to places in real life. Because businesses that they wanted to promote were places where they put these Pokemon, and so people ended up in like cafes and restaurants and stores and whatever else.
Cha-ching.
Cha-ching. And so she's really upset about this, and she's just like, this is so absurd, like it shouldn't be happening. And Russ is still sitting there in the background like,
what's the problem?
And she never got to the point where it was the fact that they can now manipulate people's opinions wantonly, not just about the goods that you buy or the places that you shop, but about political candidates and social issues.
I think at the heart of that, and at the heart of our constitutional democracy, our Republican democracy, whatever you want to call this thing that we learned about in 8th grade, is the idea that it needs to be a self-correcting system. And the minute that you are working to cull people and distort their view of reality and push them into different sectors of thought, they no longer, and screening the information they have access to, you no longer have the ability for people to evaluate how their government should look. Therefore, it stops being a government by the people, for the people. It starts being something entirely different, which is where the parallels to the totalitarianism of the Soviet Union start to become appropriate. And, just like, this is a great example. The fact that I couldn't find this freaking march on Google is just, it's not even surprising to me anymore. How did you end up finding that? But I had to search Brett. Well, I had to figure out kind of the name of it, first of all. Then I had to search the name of it plus Brett Weinstein's name.
I mean, that seems reasonable.
that I get a bunch of websites that are just anti-Trump.
Well, you searched for the wrong
They've
thing
literally
at
created
first.
websites that are just shell organizations that don't even appear to be real things.
What do you mean? Like, hold on a sec. Hold on. Like, I think that as someone who knows people that work on search, I'm like, it is almost impossible for Google to know what it is that you're searching for unless you search for the right term. And so if you just type in a random term.
That is bullshit.
What?
I'm sorry.
That's not bullshit.
It is. Like, come on, man. Like, you've searched for Google things. Like, Google shows you what it wants to show you primarily.
But the fact that you
Especially in
found it
the political
eventually,
realm.
like this is the thing. Like
I'm not saying that
we were
it's
listening.
outright
Who's that guy that was
hidden.
on
It's just
Rogan?
There's tendencies.
There's tendencies, but I'm saying that, like, if you can find it, what was it called? Save Our Republic?
The website's called jointheresistance.org. The movement is called Rescue the Republic.
Rescue the Republic. Let's see what happens.
Search.
Rescue the Republic. It's the first link. Join the resistance.
It wasn't on mine.
I mean, this...
Actually, but I think I was trying stuff like Save the Republic, March on Washington.
Sure. But so I'm just trying to say that it's like, if there are plenty of examples where Google like
so if I type
hides things.
Save Our Republic, I get this. The first hit is this anti-Trump website.
Sure, but that doesn't necessarily... That might mean that the people who organized the Rescue the Republic March weren't smart enough to name it something that wasn't already at the top of Google. Like, everybody who's ever tried to name something knows that you, like, if something has better search rank than you can't name it the same thing because your thing won't come up on top. Like, some of this is conspiratorial and actually viable, and some of this is conspiratorial and you're like, do you actually understand how Google works? Like, you can't name your thing something that already exists and has better reputation than your thing. Like, it doesn't work that way. Google will never serve you something that's brand new, that's never been indexed or backlinked or cross-linked or whatever the fuck they call it, if there's already something with that same name that has been. And so I'm just like, if I can find it immediately by typing the right name into it, it's hard for me to be like, well, they're hiding it from us. Because I'm like, well, if you type the right... It's like when Robert... What was his name? Robert Eisen...
I mean, perhaps...
Epstein. When Robert Epstein was on Rogan, and he was talking about the fact that Proton Mail was, like, hidden off of Google. And then Rogan looks for it, and it's, like, right there. And Epstein ends up having to be like, well, it used to be hidden off of Google. I'm like, I think that it's really...
There was a big lawsuit, right? It turns out. He presented that rather poorly.
But the only point that I'm making is I'm like, if we accuse them of these things, there must be plenty of examples that we can accuse them accurately of it. But, like, if you're not typing the right thing into Google and it's not coming up, it's like, that's hardly... I don't think that it's a fair accusation.
It's a very difficult thing to study, first of all, because Google won't admit to the fact that they blacklist different things, right? Or graylist things, or downregulate things. But everybody who's been privy to the upper echelons will tell you that that's exactly what's happening. But the problem is, there's thousands of people working at Google, and probably 3 of them are part of that operation. Like, there have been these, like, CIA overtones with these mass media corporations since ever.
I just think that it doesn't help to point to things that appear at the top of Google when you type the right name into it as evidence for that blacklisting. Because I'm like, for it to be blacklisted, you would have to type the name in and have it not be findable.
Yeah, I didn't remember the name. It's true.
That's all that I'm saying.
I think some of the things that, what was that guy's name? Epstein?
Yeah.
Was pointing to was kind of the autofill stuff as well.
Yes.
And, like, that was more the experience that I just had in real time when I was looking for this, right? Was that it was autofilling me towards this other point. I mean, I just felt like it was pushing me towards a different set of information, which was contrary to what I was looking for.
And that's a really, really subtle thing, and it's hard to measure and to claim. And so it's like figuring out how to actually talk about that.
That's what I want to point out that strikes me as very different from the Soviet situation. The word subtle is extremely important. By the way, that word subtle, it has a really negative overtone.
Speaking of subtle, is everybody sufficiently freaked out about how subtle this year's election is in this country?
Oh, the primary?
Not the primary, like the election's in, like, isn't it? It's in a month. The election is in a month. It does not feel like it is A, an election year, B, that there's really an election that's about to happen. It's such a weird, quiet background thing. I have seen a lot more political science going up, so I guess maybe that's one meat space signal.
I mean, I think it speaks to the evaporation of the center. It's like you either get on board with one of these radical camps or you just don't vote.
But usually it's like the radical camps are everywhere, right? You open the news, you turn on the television, you go onto YouTube, everybody's talking about it, it's on Twitter, it's in all these places. It just seems like they've managed to astroturf it in the past, and this is a weird year where they're not doing it. Maybe because she's such a bad candidate.
They both are. They're both really terrible candidates, is the fact of the matter. And the question is, which one can you get behind more?
Yeah, which bad candidate will win?
Right.
But so what were you saying about the definition of subtle? You said it's got like a negative connotation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the resources open to me, but it's essentially, it's defined, as making use of clever and indirect methods to achieve something. And I think that's what we're staring down the barrel of. When, this word appears in Genesis, actually, referring to the snake as having subtle motions, as it sort of tempts the Adam and Eve narrative into unfolding.
It's not easily understood from the Old French subtil and from the Latin subtilis.
What's the Latin subtilis? Which seems like the French must descend from. It's a bacteria.
That's my first thought. So it means underwoven. Basically, it's
under the surface of the water.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, yeah, it's like not easily, there's something beneath the surface. That makes sense.
And I think that's what's really interesting in my experience with the bureaucratic totalization of society, is that there's really nothing firm to put your finger on, right? Like, I've had this experience.
The Committee on Committees?
Yeah, I got this hilarious email. So I teach this class at the university, one class, which shouldn't be too much of a nightmare because it's only one class, but the administrative...
You should lay out this entire arc where you basically went through this entire process where...
Yeah, start at the beginning.
So you taught this class, which was part of the GE requirements.
Yeah, so all kids have to take a science class. Probably a good idea, right? I mean, at least to familiarize yourself with what the hell science is, since it's being weaponized as a word in every political discourse on the planet right now.
And I think you provided a very noble outline of that through the lens of astrophysics and cosmology.
That's a cool one to understand science, because especially planetary science, the formation of the Earth and all of this, these things are on the move. Huge. I always tell my kids there's no better example than planetary science, because we didn't have access to all these solar systems until 10, 15 years ago. Really, it's all coming in right now.
Access is also like a dubious claim even now, right? Like, we have pictures. We had pictures of Mars for a long ass time, and we were like deeply wrong about what was there once we actually landed.
But even with this like really sketchy data that we have, our entire story about our own solar system and our planet was based on our solar system and our planet for 300 years since the Enlightenment. And then all of a sudden we start seeing all these other solar systems and we're like, wait a second, ours doesn't really look much like those, but they all kind of look the same. So what's going on here? So
you teach this class, GE, tons of students, a lot of interest because they have to take a class that fulfills this requirement.
Yeah, and astronomy is fun. Everybody likes the sky. So there's a lot of kids in it. And then kind of actually without telling me one year, this is my third year doing it. So I think the second year, without telling me, they reformatted the GE college and they call it something else. And it doesn't really matter. But
there was some bureaucratic deadline. Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
a bureaucrat went missing.
Yeah, so our department chair in physics quit to become an accountant,
actuary.
basically. She was like, I need to make more money.
And then you got folded into the business department.
All this reorganization, but for whatever reason, my class didn't get listed in the GE catalog.
Because there was nobody to shepherd it through, and nobody even sent you an email to be like, hey, buddy, if you want this to actually have enrollment, you have to do this thing.
Yeah, they were like, your department chair should have done this, but she didn't. And she quit suddenly. And so I'm like, okay, I'll do it, and it's a lot of work. as you can imagine, in any bureaucratic structure, I had no idea how much work it was going to be, but to reformat my class according to these new rules of what the new version of general education wanted out of a science class. And they have a whole new branding for it and everything, and you have to check all these boxes. So anyways, I start going back and forth with a few local bureaucrats in terms of like how to package my course so that it will make it through the first committee. I didn't know that was the first committee at the time.
You thought it was like the final committee. You were
Yeah.
like, one and done.
I was like, it has to go to the committee, whatever.
You fool.
Anyways, so I don't get paid for any of this work, by the way. So I'm just an adjunct professor. I get paid. This is the real singer too, is I get paid based on how many students enroll in my class. And so my pay was cut significantly that first year when I didn't have the same enrollments. Yeah, it's really bad. It's really, really bad. It's basically a volunteer position at this point. I mean, it probably pays for my gas and like my lunch or something. So what happened was it goes through, I go back and forth with this bureaucrat until, two different bureaucrats until the course is up to par. My proposal is good enough. She's like, it'll make it through the committee. Goes to the first committee. Committee sends it back because they have some trifling little box that wasn't checked, you know? And the first bureaucrat didn't recognize it. The second bureaucrat didn't recognize it. So we fixed that. Have to wait another month for it to go through the committee again. Goes through that committee, passes. Now it has to go to the Senate hearing where, you know, it just goes right through, no problem. The problem is neither one of those bureaucrats knew about a third committee, which was the scheduling committee, which had to actually put it on the map for the following academic year. And nobody told me about it and nobody did anything. And so
It's not that they needed to schedule it. It's that they needed to put it into the right list of courses that were scheduled with this tag of fulfilling a general education requirement. So now it's on the schedule.
And it'll count for your general education requirement too.
Really?
Yeah, it absolutely will.
It just wasn't labeled as that in the system.
And what makes it okay? So I'm like, wow, what a nightmare. So I have only 30 kids in my class. I had 200 the first semester I taught this. So what's really sad is I'm like, okay, whatever. I can suffer through one semester. We'll get it fixed by winter. I go to the bureaucrats right when I start teaching this semester. I'm like, hey, you know, I don't know whose fault this is. Actually, I walk into the office, by the way, the first day, and they're all super apologetic. Oh, you know, I'm so sorry this happened. You know, we'll get it fixed. It's gonna be okay. I'm like, okay. So I go to the bureaucrat who's in charge, and she's like, nobody will take responsibility. I don't know how this happened. You know, there's this person and this person and this person are all responsible, and I didn't get the email about this, and I didn't find out about this committee. So I go to the bureaucrat that's most pointed at. And I go to this bureaucrat and I'm like, hey, you know, no hard feelings. Like, let's just get this settled for winter term because this is abysmal. And I'm having a hard time justifying this to my family. That's what I tell her. She goes, yeah.
The family is me and the cat.
Yeah, you and Mingus. But I figure that's like the best way I can phrase it to her. Because, you know, they're all about... Ostensibly, they're all about caring and compassion and stuff. And she's like, yeah, no, the scheduling committee only meets once a year. So we're not going to be able to fix that for winter. And it sucks because, you know, on one hand, I have every right to just walk right out of this situation. On the other hand, it's sad because it deprives the students that I've already had a couple classes with. I mean, that really screws them because their schedules are already loaded and everything. And on the other hand, it's extra sad because I put all this work into developing this new course, which honestly I think is going to be a better course. It's more about generating new theories, even like half-baked theories about how these different bodies in the solar system might form based on literature assessments and bringing themselves up to speed with all the different ideas that are showing up on the scene right now.
But it's insane because you know that there is a toggle switch somewhere.
Yeah.
Like that one person would have to go in and just hit the toggle switch and have it work and have it be decent. And the bureaucratic strictures say that there is protocol, the protocol must be followed, and there is no exception to the protocol, even if it means that we deny the students a really interesting class where they're forced to use their brains and pushes them into new heights of trying to understand what science actually is, which is ostensibly the goal of the general education program. So the bureaucracy is so entrenched that they will take away from the students the ability to actually experience what the learning objective is, to put it in the bureaucratic terms, because they think that the bureaucracy is more important than the objective. That's, I think, that's what it is in a nutshell. It's the fact that the obeisance to the bureaucracy is the most important thing. It trumps absolutely everything. It trumps you, it trumps the students, it trumps the university, it trumps everything.
Yeah, it's so painful too from an educator's perspective too, or just like from a cog in this machine. Like one of the things, the last email correspondence I had with the bureaucrat who's, I don't know, the department chair, we don't need to point these people out totally, but she's like, yeah, I just got an email from this dean. Oh, I got copied on it too. And there's some new dean. I've never met this person before. Doesn't introduce himself to me, but just writes back like, I don't understand why the enrollment's so bad. I think it's because the class got scheduled for the afternoon instead of 8 a.m.
Which I'm like, I saw that and it was just so absurd.
I'm just like, dude, I live an hour away from campus. Driving at 6 a.m. in the snow over the mountains is not a good situation.
Well, not only that, but what class has higher enrollment at 8 a.m. than it does at 3 o'clock in the afternoon? That's just insane.
It's completely insane.
Completely insane.
And it's just it was just so dehumanizing, right? If this guy would have been like, hey, let me introduce myself. I'm the new dean, good to meet you or something. But just to like bark this like nonsense across the channels, like,
yeah.
With this authority, who gave him this authority? Like, who the hell is this guy?
But the cherry on the whipped cream sundae is that you got an email a day later about some announcement because the committee on committees was gathering in order to decide something about some minutia for all committees. And so my first thought is, when does the committee on committees meet? But perhaps that's just vested in the authority of the dean or something, one person. But we had the exact same thing happen when we were at the Grand Canyon. We had to rent a car. And so we're at Alamo, and the way that the company rented the cars is not through a business account. They have some, like, the owners have a personal Costco membership, and so they rented everything through the Costco membership, and they randomly assigned names to the reservations of the guides. And so when we show up, the guy behind the counter needs a credit card that is in the name of the person who is renting the car in order to process the reservation. And because the reservations haven't been paid for, that card is getting charged for the full price of the reservation. And we have the company cards, and only one of us has a company card. We have 3 company cards, we're renting 3 vehicles, but only one company card has the name of the guide on it, because he's like the permanent member. And so we're standing there with the person who's renting us the car, and we're like, look, we all work for this company. We all have W-2s. We all have evidence for the fact that we work for this company. Is there any way that we can put the payment on the company card instead of on our personal cards? And he's like, no. The card on the account has to match the name. And I was like, why? And he's like, because of liability. And I was like, that's fine. So liability we can deal with. We can put our own cards down for the liability, because liability is only if you get into an accident. We're not going to get into accidents. And it's like, okay, can we pay for the reservation with a company card and then put our own card down for the liability? He's like, no. I'm like, why? He's like, because the liability has to be tied to the name of the person who's renting the car. I'm like, it will be. The only thing that we want to pay for is the rental cost itself. And we just went back and forth for, I don't know, maybe like a minute. And it was just this hard line stop of, no, we can't do that. And it was weird because the reason didn't make any sense, right? Because he's like, the liability has to be in the name of the person who's driving the car. And I'm like, but we can do that. Like, you can just...
Well, this is what becomes so frustrating, is that the individual cogs, the bureaucrats in this case, are absolutely terrified that they're going to make a mistake and end up in some sort of turmoil as a result of it. They would rather follow the line than try to make any reasoned actions that might violate the policies that they've been handed down, regardless of how little sense they make.
And so this is what Jung's talking about when he differentiates between like religion and creed.
Yes,
right?
That's something we should talk about.
It looks like you have something pulled up, though. Do you want to like?
No, I'm searching for something that ties into. I mean, we can overview that though, so I think it's really important because, it's often thought and spoken that in the Soviet Union, for instance, that they abolished religion, but the reality of the situation was that the religion became the state, which was just this utter obedience to the bureaucratic hierarchy. But Jung, and this confused me a little bit at first, he defines religion very differently and in opposition to the concept of creed.
He almost defines it like William James does in his Varieties of Religious Experience. He's like, it is a personal experience that one individual has with the cosmos. It has nothing to do with the church. It has nothing to do with the state. Religion is it's almost like ego death is roughly how he puts it. And you cannot do that in context of a system or in context of a bureaucracy or a state. It literally has to be a person going out into the world and meeting their God, whatever that might be, and recognizing that there is something that they are subsumed into that is infinite, vast, and free of all of this.
Yeah, he puts God in quotes usually too, because he's trying to stay away from the sky god notion, essentially.
Right.
But yes, exactly.
We should read Spinoza next, because Spinoza was one of the early people who was like, I don't think there's a sky god.
Well, yeah. So this is getting closer to Jung's solution set, but needless to say, when we think about something like the Catholic Church or the Church of Islam or whatever organization, that has escaped containment of religion for Jung. That would be a creed. And he is very skeptical of the utility of creeds because the creeds allow people, just like in these mass bureaucratic organizations that often resort to the legal code to instruct and inform their actions, the creeds allow people to show up once a week, join in some, lecture essentially, and then completely offshore the decision-making beyond their own individual reasoning and contemplation to some organized system. And so that's one thing about bureaucracies is that people kind of love them because they purport to make everybody's lives easier. They're like, oh, we'll take care of that. You're worried about getting sick. We'll give you health insurance, right? You're worried about whatever, rent or anything, like we'll take care of that. And in this case with creeds, they're like, oh, you're worried about your existential place in the world. We'll guarantee that to you. And so throughout this book, Jung is very suspicious of the idea that they can offer anything in the way of that because of the fact that it requires actual personal discovery and self-reflection. And that when he says God, he really just means one's relationship to some higher purpose and some sense of how their individual life fits into the greater cosmic structure.
And he also is basically like, look, when you have a creed, the creed requires de-individuation because a creed is a set of rules and strictures that everybody bows to without really thinking too much about them. They don't think about whether they're right. They don't think about whether they're just. They don't think about whether or not they're the best ones. They're just kind of like, no, this is what we do here. This is like what our people does. This is what our kind does. And he makes the case that this structure gives rise to the control of psychopaths. He starts out the book with this, right? He says, the first line of the book is, what will the future bring? And he's like, everybody's always been obsessed with trying to understand what is happening. And so he says, today, as the end of the second millennium draws near, we are again living in an age filled with apocalyptic images of universal destruction. What is the significance of that split, symbolized by the Iron Curtain, which divides humanity into two halves? What will become of our civilization and of man himself if the hydrogen bombs begin to go off, or if the spiritual and moral darkness of state absolutism should spread over Europe? And he says we should have no reason to take this threat lightly. Everywhere in the West, there are subversive minorities who, sheltered by our humanitarianism and our sense of justice, hold the incendiary torches ready, with nothing to stop the spread of their ideas except the critical reason of a single, fairly intelligent, mentally stable stratum of the population. One should not, however, overestimate the thickness of this stratum. It varies from country to country in accordance with national temperament. Also, it is regionally dependent on public education and is subject to the influence of acutely disturbing factors of a political and economic nature. Then he goes on to talk about what percentage of the people he thinks that it is, and he's like, it can't be more than 40% of people. He's basically like, the number of sane people in any society is less than the majority. Since the gift of reason and critical reflection is not one of man's outstanding peculiarities, and even where it exists, it proves to be wavering and inconstant, the more so, as a rule, the bigger the political groups are. He's basically saying that we're a little bit screwed, and that rationality can only be conducted, rational argument can be conducted with some prospect of success, only so long as the emotionality of a given situation does not exceed a certain critical degree. If the affective temperature rises above this level, the possibility of reasons having any effect ceases, and its place is taken by slogans and chimerical wish fantasies.
So he sets up this dichotomy between the world and the cosmic in some sense. And he talks about how the state basically offers to take care of, first of all, it sets a huge priority on the world being the central value for one's life. So one's material success in the world, one's ability to climb the ladder, the state can guarantee all of these things. But one's personal, I hate that he uses the word religion, but we're going to go with it, because what he really means is your sense of purpose in the world and your relationship to the cosmos. But he says the religions teach another authority opposed to that of the world. And so, by the way, he believes that at the core of all the creeds is a religion. There is some actual knowledge about how to connect yourself with the universe that often gets captured and corrupted by the development of the creeds and the churches and all of this. But he still refers to it as religion. The doctrine of the individual's dependence on God makes just as high a claim upon him as the world does. It may even happen that the absoluteness of this claim estranges him from the world in the same way that he is estranged from himself when he succumbs to the collective mentality. He can forfeit his judgment and power of decision in the former case, for the sake of religious doctrine, quite as much as the latter. This is the goal religions openly aspire to unless they compromise with the state. When they do, I prefer to not call them religions, but creeds. A creed gives expression to a definite collective belief, whereas the word religion expresses a subjective relationship to certain metaphysical, extra-mundane factors. A creed is a confession of faith intended chiefly for the world, and is thus an intramundane affair, while the meaning and purpose of religion lie in the relationship of the individual to God, or to the path of salvation and liberation. From this basic fact, all ethics is derived, which, without the individual's responsibility before God, can be called nothing more than conventional morality. He actually, in this sense, defines, what's really interesting to me, is he defines creeds as being a compromise with the state, where they take a religious revelation and they blend it in such a way that it makes it a worldly situation that in some sense is like a flypaper that allows the state to wield it.
Where he's basically like, he's a dualist, and so he starts by saying that the power of religion is that it says that there is something that you are obligated to that is as important as the world, which is spirit, cosmos, is it the super ego? What's the thing that like is the collective unconscious, whatever you want to call it. So religions basically teach you that this thing is really, really important, and that if you obey the power and the strength of that obligation, it can estrange you from the world. Like we see this in religious hermits, people that turn away, saints, like people who turn away from the world in order to pursue what they're doing. Like you can look at even I think like Fred Becky. Do you remember that movie we watched, The Dirtbag Guy? I feel like in some way he was kind of a patron saint of the climbing world. People that are so devoted to this thing that they love that everything else falls away. And they're difficult people and they come with problems and they're certainly deeply individualistic and almost uncontrollable by the state. Like they have one thing that they do and they do it really well. And so having this faith pulls you away from it. And he's like, he can forfeit his judgment and power of decision for the sake of religious doctrine quite as much as he can for the collective mentality. And so he's like the collective so if you have religious doctrine, on one level that's absconding from the world, and then on the other hand you have the collective mentality, which is the thing that you can also completely abjectly abandon yourself to in the same way, but its orientation is world rather than spirit. Mm-hmm. And he's like, and to connect it back to the thing that I was saying at the beginning is he was like, look, there are psychopaths walking among us, and most people don't have a very good sense of what to orient themselves towards, and it's very, very dangerous because when you have these creeds that are written by psychopaths that do not have your best interest at heart, but have some kind of fervent, hyper-religious manifestation of bureaucratic will or whatever else in mind, they'll screw you deeply without you ever realizing, because most people don't have the ability to look at something like that and be like, what the fuck? And I think that this is what he's saying here, where it's like we talk of creeds as opposed to religious orientations, because he bends religion as being the world of spirit and creed as being the world of the collective mind. Mm-hmm. And so the creeds are the things that people devote themselves to because they're not sufficiently strongly individuated to be able to resist their force.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting. You know, this is something I try to impress upon my students every year too, is how bizarre it is that when we look at the cosmos, right, even the fact that cosmology is squarely situated in physics departments is very, very suspicious to me.
So wait, say that one more time. The cosmology inside of physics departments is suspicious? It's
very suspicious, actually, because physics, you know, this science, I think what Jung would call science in general, but this mathematical statistical way of looking at reality misses something really critical. And I think that's Jung's main point, is that, yeah, the atoms are half the world, but there's something else happening here.
Oh, did you read that part, the thing that he had about statistics?
Yeah. The scientific education and so forth. I've got that quote right here. Scientific education is based in the main on statistical truths and abstract knowledge, and therefore imparts an unrealistic, rational picture of the world in which the individual as a merely marginal phenomenon plays no role. The individual, however, as an irrational datum, is the true and authentic carrier of reality, the concrete man, as opposed to the unreal ideal or normal man to whom the scientific statements refer. What is more, most of the natural sciences try to represent the results of their investigations as though these had come into existence without man's intervention, in such a way that the collaboration of the psyche, an indispensable factor, remains invisible.
I love that he reads this, or he writes this right after having said that he talks about the idea that science tends to treat man as a statistical unit, right? So he it says, at the same time, man, as a member of a species, can and must be described as a statistical unit. Otherwise, nothing general could be said about him. For this purpose, he has to be regarded as a comparative unit. This results in a universally valid anthropology or psychology, as the case may be, with an abstract picture of man as an average unit from which all individual features have been removed. But it is precisely these features which are of paramount importance for understanding man. If I want to understand an individual human being, I must lay aside all scientific knowledge of the average man and discard all theories in order to adopt a completely new and unprejudiced attitude. I can only approach the task of understanding with a free and open mind, whereas knowledge of man, or insight into human character, presupposes all sorts of knowledge about mankind in general. And so this is the thing, like the statistical environment in which we live, where everybody's just this, I don't want to say numerical quantity, but basically this datum that needs to be placed into the proper configuration in order to ensure a functioning system, is inherently dehumanizing.
And we see this play out in this anecdote we just gave about the university structure too, right? Where we have to rebuild this educational platform so that it's more amenable with what students really need to be learning. But in the process, it's become so oppressive that you've driven out most of the teachers who would be willing to give their time to this sort of operation because you've overburdened it with rules and restraints by trying to statistically analyze what a student is, as opposed to realizing, hey, wait a second, these are people. They need to learn how to think. We probably ought to spend some money getting some people in here that can help them learn how to think.
We should probably all be able to think. If our goal is to build a system that allows students to think, should not each and every single part of it be informed by that? It seems insane to have a bureaucracy that cannot think be the vessel that attempts to teach the students to think. He has a couple of pages later, he says something really interesting where he says, but the individual, overwhelmed by the sense of his own puniness and impotence, should feel that his life has lost its meaning, which after all is not identical with public welfare and higher standards of meaning, then he is already on the road to state slavery, and without knowing or wanting it, has become its proselyte. The man who looks only outside and quails before the big battalion has no resource with which to combat the evidence of his senses and his reason. But that is just what is happening today. We are all fascinated and overawed by statistical truths and large numbers, and are daily appraised of the nullity and futility of the individual personality, since it is not represented and personified by any mass organization. Conversely, those personages who strut about on the world's stage and whose voices are heard far and wide seem, to the incredible public, to be borne along on some mass movement or on the tide of public opinion, and for this reason are either applauded or execrated. Since mass suggestion plays the predominant role here, it remains a moot point whether their message is their own, for which they are personally responsible, or whether they merely function as a megaphone for collective opinion. Under these circumstances, it is small wonder that individual judgment grows increasingly uncertain of itself, and that responsibility is collectivized as much as possible, i.e., is shuffled off by the individual and delegated to a corporate body. In this way, the individual becomes more and more a function of society, which in its turn usurps the function of the real-life carrier. Whereas in actual fact, society is nothing more than an abstract ideal like the state. Both are hypostasized, what does hypostasized mean? Oh, have become autonomous. Sorry. Both are hypostasized, that is, have become autonomous. The state in particular is turned into a quasi-animate personality from whom everything is expected. In reality, it is only a camouflage for those individuals who know how to manipulate it. Thus, the constitutional state drifts into the situation of a primitive form of society. Namely, the communism of a primitive tribe where everybody is subject to the autocratic rule of a chief or an oligarchy. So he's basically like, look, we are all subject to this feeling of smallness and impotence. You hear this all the time. People are like, well, what can I possibly do to change the world? How can I change it? And this is manifest in everything from people being like, well, I don't have a lot of power, to others who do have a lot of power being like, well, the world's going to end soon anyways, and you can't do anything about it. And so screw it. Let's just
Party.
Let's just party. We're impotent, and so we might as well just accept that. And so when everybody is impotent, there's not really anything to do except to worship these ideas of statistical truths, that people are like this. This is the mass culture. This is the mass message. This is the thing that we are consuming. And so the megaphone falls to people who are willing to repeat the mass truths that are the easiest to get people to center around, and the only ones that are allowed to surface. Like, we've had multiple people tell us that the CIA no longer assassinates people. The CIA just controls what you can say on the internet. And so...
primarily through funding and visibility. Yeah.
Funding and algorithmic prominence, right? If you never make it to the top of the algorithmic chains, then nobody can ever hear the things that you say, whether or not they're appealing.
And that's the subtle oppression that's very difficult to put your finger on as it's happening. This is the frog being boiled alive situation that I think we're facing today.
And it's really interesting that he basically is cautioning against having a large state. Right? He says, the state in particular is turned into a quasi-animate personality from whom everything is expected. In reality, it is only a camouflage for those individuals who know how to manipulate it. He's basically saying that when you depend upon the state for everything, the state is not your mom or dad. It's not actually providing you with everything in a way that is free of strings. It's actually manipulating you because you come to depend on it. And so because it's the teat from which you drink, you must obey the message that comes from it, because if you challenge it, the milk is cut off, and then you're screwed.
Which ultimately weakens your individual agency, because you're not exercising those muscles that you need in order to perform a life in real time.
And it's like really interesting, because I haven't been able to satisfactorily figure out for myself where the line for a society is, where it becomes too big or too strong. Like, we've had societies for forever. We've had empires for forever. Is this... like, where's the line? Is this, because you started at the beginning of the conversation, you said something really interesting, where you're like, people try to equate the thing that we're going through right now with other things that have happened in the past. Communism, Rome, Nazis, whatever. And I'm like, is it the same? It seems like there's something about social media and the way that it bonds all of our minds together in this really effective way that's categorically different from anything that's ever happened before.
And there's some parallels, there's some differences. I'm trying to find them as we go through this, but he's definitely pointing to the ways in which the state has subsumed religious ideas in such a way that it can exclude the possibility that people are actually connecting with their cosmic purposes, because it's quite productive to the state. The one that I'm most familiar with is the insistence on the rationality of science and the state, as opposed to the idiocy and primitive superstitious nature of religious thinking. Which is funny, because I feel like the one thing that the state-centered scientists are always pointing at, and my textbook is the same, this is not how my class actually goes, but they very much like to point at the sky god and talk about how dumb and superstitious those people are who believe in these mythical entities, which is not, it's like unbelievably ignorant, because clearly the people who promulgated these mythologies were not trying to take them as literal entities. They just realized that the best way to transmit knowledge in an oral tradition is by gripping stories. And the reality is, and Jung gets into this in the back half of the book, that if you don't pick up on the symbolic nature of these mythical entities, you are not only missing the point, but you're feeding the monster, because the monster loves to point at the literal interpretation of the mythological entities as a reason to discredit them. Because the state cannot tolerate any oppositional, superarching deity like a god. They can't tolerate a real relationship to a cosmic order, because if they did, they would realize that they're opposed to it. People would realize that they're opposed to that, right? Because this is something that doesn't have anything to do with the world. It has to do with how you behave when nobody's looking, right? And ultimately that plays out in the way you behave when people are looking too. But the trick to having a strong inner psyche, or what Jung would call a good relationship with God, is that you learn how to behave when people aren't staring at you too. The state couldn't give a shit about that. It actually just wants you to behave the way it wants you to behave in order to be a nice piece of its statistical plan, which ultimately is run by some maniacs at the top who are feeding off of this fire.
Well, I'm like, the thing that really gets me about this is I feel like Russ Roberts talking to Shoshana Zuboff. I'm like, God, I really like the things that the state provides.
To some extent.
To a large extent. Like, we don't make a lot of money, and the state helps us make sure that we have healthcare and we have food. The state makes...
I don't really use the healthcare. I mean, it's...
Well, the healthcare where we live is horrific, but I think it's horrific even for people that have private insurance. Like, I think that there's just... poor people don't get healthcare, and we live in a poor area, and so it's not... it's bad for everybody. But when we were in Portland, I think that it was decent. We could at least get our teeth cleaned. Like, we could, and the doctors had good ratings, and they were beloved and well reviewed. Like, we didn't use it a lot, but it was available.
I mean, the fact of the matter is that I would love to be able to move myself out of depending on the state, and I'm oriented constantly towards being able to do that. Is this the truth of the matter?
That's true, but without the state, we would not have been able to do this. We would be working day jobs, and we would be working on the podcast with a tenth of the enthusiasm and time that we have right now. I
don't think that he's an anarchist.
The state builds the roads, the state builds the telegraph wires, the telephone wires, maintains the infrastructure. It ensures... I
actually don't think that this is a document that's anti-state at all. I think that he's trying to point out the danger of abandoning personal religion to the state. In other words, the state will happily take on that role of being your God if you're not careful. And I think this is what we see playing out in partisan politics. I think that if we'd been alive a couple hundred years ago, we would have seen the exact same kind of fervor about creed-based religions as well. But we don't see that as much anymore. It's been transferred onto the state in our modern age.
Can you elaborate on that? I don't totally know what you mean.
I think that people would have had very strong opinions about which creed was the proper creed in ages past that would have been unifying or polarizing similarly.
Can you do you have any specific things that you're thinking
I mean, the Crusades is a great example.
You don't think that's religion? You think that's creed?
Of course, yeah. Because it's state-based.
I see.
Yeah, so I think that in our modern age, the state is happy to take on this godlike worship. They're happy to be worshipped as a god, right? On either side of that monster's, its right hand or its left hand. You see the same... not what Jung would call religious fervor, but I think what most people would refer to as religious fervor, the way that people get worked up completely irrationally about either side of it, right? They'll latch on to some little point and blow it completely out of proportion to the point that it defines their entire existence and orientation towards that political structure. Mm-hmm. So I think that the danger is that the state completely marginalizes the individual and the individual's relationship to the cosmos and to the individual's purpose in life, because it offers to take care of that problem for you. Oh, well, your purpose is just to serve me. It's not that he thinks that we can he's not an anarchist. He doesn't think that we can't have a, let's say, adversarial but healthy relationship with the state. And I think that's the way the founding fathers would have looked at it as well with our own country. You should be suspicious of the state. It will absolutely take over reality if you're not careful. And so our job as citizens, and this is where the modern crisis becomes paramount as far as I can tell, our job is to make ourselves very suspicious of the state, to be very careful about what powers we grant to it, and what powers we granted over our daily lives. And the problem, the really subtle, creepy aspect of the modern era is that in order to do that, you need to have access to information. You need to know what's happening. You need to know what your state is doing. And that's never been more difficult, as far as I can tell, for an educated person to actually get to the bottom of. There's plenty of information available if you know where to look, but knowing where to look is very, very difficult.
So I don't know about that. You and I have talked about this before. I think everything that you've said up until that very last statement about the fact that it's never been this hard before is 100% the case. But I'm like, the newspapers used to be owned by people that were the richest people in the country that were deeply tied to the interests of the state. The telegraph wires were, nobody was able to transmit.
Well, during the revolution, our revolution, there was a lot of pamphlet printing. So there was literal distribution. The printing press was, only, a couple centuries old. People had printing presses, and that was a very primary means by which information was distributed. And that really fired up the landowners because they were able to primarily get access to these things. It kind of takes me back to the early days of the internet when everybody had their own blogs and websites, and people were able to pass these things around by hand to some extent. Now it seems like the way that people get information is through state-controlled channels. That's where things have gotten a little bit towards the state as God situation.
But I would bet that even back in the day during the American Revolution, most people were getting their information from the state. And some small fraction of very passionate people were passing around the samizdat to spread the ideas around that were enabled by the printing press. And I'm like, there's encrypted channels that you can use that aren't state controlled. It's like Telegram and WhatsApp and Signal.
It's not
and all
a hopeless situation.
I'm just saying that you made a very concrete statement that it's never been harder, and I'm like, I actually think that it's never been easier because in order to get a pamphlet,
I can defend it further. So I think that in former ages before the internet, there was a lot more physical meetings and physical assemblies and physical contact. And I think people were much more likely to be hanging out with their neighbors and the people in their communities and their localities, and their organizations carried a lot more informational capital than today, where people spend most of their time staring at a screen to get information. And that those screens are so easily filtered and controlled, right? That's the what I see as the crisis of the modern age. There's so much information out there. You're right. You can actually get to the bottom of almost everything if you know where to look. But it's going back to what Jung says at the beginning, that maybe you have 40% of the population that's capable and willing to do such rational investigation, but the rest of them are reading the New York Times. Right? The rest of them are watching Fox News or whatever it is.
I would even go farther than that. And I would say that, let's say that you do have 40% of the population that's capable of it, that at a time where everything's really expensive, most of those people are probably preoccupied with the work of making enough money to raise a family and secure an existence. And so even that 40% shrinks down deeper until you have a very small percentage of people that have the time and the effort and the will. I think
it's way smaller than 40 Young.
Yeah. I think the capacity is in 40%.
I see.
That's what he's saying. He's not, and so what we're saying is,
by the way, what are all those people doing in order to make bread?
That's what I'm trying to say. They have to serve some structural organization.
Some corporate bureaucracy for the most part.
Right. And so
so they get really good at it, and they get really comfortable at it, and their language adopts to the scenarios, and their politics follows from what's appropriate for them to advance in their corporate bureaucratic structures.
I like to think that I've met about 40% of people that work these jobs that are kind of not really playing the career game and recognize it for what it is, and are just like, well, look, you have to do this to some degree of proficiency in order to survive. And I don't want to live like you do, and so I'm going to do this thing because it is what ensures that I don't have to live like you do. And that's fine. That's okay. But they recognize that it's absurd. And I think that if you could provide them with a different alternative, they would be easily swayed. But the thing that I always come down to Oh, go ahead.
Oh, it's just wild because I had some conversations with my students this week, outside of class, and I'm like, what do you aspire to? Like, what are you interested in? I'm talking to like one student who's a business major. Oh, do you have a company you want to start or something? No, they want a secure place in the bureaucracy.
Yeah, of course, everybody does.
Right.
And so that's what I'm trying to say, is that if you can offer people security in a way that is outside of the bureaucracy, they'll go for it. Because even from the conversation that you recounted to me, she recognized that this was absurd and that she wasn't passionate about it. But she was like, look, I want to have the trappings of reasonable security, which is if I get sick, I have the money to take care of myself and I'll be able to help my parents as they get old. These are really, really, really basic desires that I think I cannot fault anyone for having them. And I'm kept awake at night by what is going to happen if one of us gets really sick. I'm kept awake at night by what's going to happen if one of our parents gets really sick. Because I'm like, we do not have the safety net that the people who have worked, $200,000 a year jobs for 30 years have. And that is the sacrifice that we've made.
Yeah, for me, it's not a sacrifice, right?
It is a huge sacrifice.
But for me, it's not, because I don't think that how this play ends is the most important part of the play. Like, yeah, I'm going to get sick and die eventually. But I don't think any amount of healthcare is going to stop that from happening. I see people go and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in the healthcare system and they just die an even more painful death than if they just closed down shop and died at home with their family.
It's all along the way. It's the fact that you go to the grocery store and you look at the stuff that's in the food that is good for you, and you look at the stuff that's in the food that's going to give you cancer, and you realize that the stuff that's filled with the poison is cheaper. Right? It's like, it's not about the end, like the last 10 years of your life, as much as it is about the fact of like, what are you going to do to make sure that you live in a place where everybody around you isn't dumping pesticides into your well? Like, these are the things that I'm like, this is a sacrifice that we make. Because the people who are rich can afford to live in a place that's clean. They can afford to eat clean. They can afford to extend their lives because their nutrition is on point. And that is, it's hard for me to look at that and not to be like, this is absolutely a thing that we are trading. And you can say that it's not a sacrifice, but it's absolutely a thing that we've traded.
I don't know. I mean, I'd say we spend as much as we need to on food that's good, and we eat really, really well. And I think that's always, since I met you, that's been one of our highest priorities financially. The same with making sure that we have a good place to keep our bodies healthy, right? Whatever gym memberships we need, we're rock climbers, so that's usually what we spend a lot of money on. I mean, those are our highest priorities, and you're right, we don't have monies to go to Fiji every weekend, but...
Not even to go to Fiji, but I'm like, I look around at the place where we live, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure that there's not good stuff in the water.
Yeah, but we don't drink the water.
We do, actually. It's all of our tea and coffee water comes from that water.
I mean,
and we shower in that water. Yeah. It's not filtered for anything substantive. And it's in the dust. It's in the air. Like, you breathe it every single day.
Well, let's be clear. Like, we're not living here because we can't afford to live somewhere else.
We actually...
I don't think that living in the city is going to be a much better situation for you. You got brake dust. I mean, there's no safe place in this country.
I think that there are.
Where?
And I think that it's probably like
Montana?
The areas of the California coast that are more than 150 miles away from a military base.
I don't know. You still have industrial or agricultural runoff.
So you have to be on a river that runs through a scenic area, and you have to be sufficiently far from a military base. It's probably Oregon coast more than it is here. But then you run into the fact that your entire life becomes centered around, how do I have enough money to be able to leave this place to participate in the rest of the world? It just, the point that I'm trying to make is not the fact that we are poor or we're not poor. The fact that I'm trying to make is that anybody who chooses to turn their back on the bureaucracy is making a massive sacrifice of some kind. And it is totally reasonable that people want to be ensconced in the system, because the system provides for them the satisfying and comforting aspects that they will have the proper number of tokens in their token account to be able to take care of the people that they love when something bad happens. And we don't have that. And nobody who lives the way that we do has that. The only thing that we can provide for our family is the fact that we've like gone out into the world and done something that's really meaningful. But we've sacrificed the conventional trappings.
Let's be clear. Like, our families have slaved away in their own corporate nightmares for their lives, and they essentially have themselves taken care of through the end of their lives. So we're very lucky in that respect. I am personally not worried about the end point for myself. I lose no sleep over it whatsoever. I understand this will end, and I am very skeptical that the state's medical bureaucracy is going to do anything to slow that.
No, but I think that, like I said, that having enough tokens in your account to be able to make radical choices for yourself is a comfort that I understand why people succumb to it. And so if the goal is to allow people to choose differently, there has to be something that also offers them some modicum of security, because that's what people are after. People want to feel secure. They want to feel like they're not going to die hungry and on the streets. And that's the thing that hangs over everybody's heads, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to I understand why people make that compromise, and I did too for many, 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 many years, right? It is very soothing, but you also spend 8 hours a day sitting around being like, there's got to be a better way to live than this. There's got to be a way that I can actually be spending 100% of my time doing things I care about. And what would that do to my health and well-being? I think this is something that Jung gets onto. I can't find a quote about it, but I think one of the things he harps on about this is that looking at health explicitly in terms of a physicalist approach, in other words, going to the doctor, having health insurance, is a little bit missing the points.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I mean, there's lots of reasons for this, perhaps, but the amount that I get sick now versus when I was working in a place that I felt like I was just wasting 8 hours a day, or at least, maybe there was some modicum of interest in my profession at the time, and I was getting maybe 1 hour a day of interest out of it, but the 7 hours that I was just sitting around feeling like I was dying, my body was young, but I felt like I was much more sick all of the time as a result of it.
Yeah.
I don't think that can be ignored.
No, and I don't think that it's necessarily about ignoring that. It's just about realizing that there is a cost. So there's basically two ways out. One way out is down, is to look around and to be like, what can I live without? What can I survive without? How much can I strip away in order to get at the bare bones of existence in such a way that it allows me to do the things that I love and sacrifice all the things that I don't necessarily care about, which in some ways oftentimes ends up being like having a family, right? The people that live really close to the wire tend to not have a ton of children or any children. The other direction is to go up and to basically find a way to rise up above the bureaucracy in such a way where you're able to start something and make something that is like playing the state and the bureaucracy like a game in order to ensure your financial well-being. But in the middle is this eternal folding into the scrum of the state and its obligations and all of the strictures that it places on you. And I think that the only two ways out are up and down. You can't stay in the middle. You'll be lost in the churn for forever.
Yeah, I think that what Jung is trying to say here is that the state does promise all of this short term, like it promises this beautiful facade. You're right. Like, yeah, we got your health taken care of, we got your rent taken care of, and you're like, oh great, those are what I need. And the reality is that there's a huge vacuum left in the wake of those basic needs being covered. That, okay, as soon as you have those things taken care of, now what? Now you've basically surrendered your entire existence to those two needs in a way that leads to a lot of chaos. This is an interesting quote here. To be sure, we all say that this is the century of the common man, that he is the lord of the earth, the air, and the water, and that on his decisions hangs the historical fate of the nations. This proud picture of human grandeur is unfortunately an illusion only, and is counterbalanced by a reality which is very different. In this reality, man is the slave and the victim of the machines that have conquered space and time for him. He is intimidated and endangered by the might of the war technique, which is supposed to safeguard his physical existence, his spiritual and moral freedom. Though guaranteed within the limits of one half of his world, is threatened with chaotic disorientation, and in the other half it is abolished altogether. Finally, to add comedy to the tragedy, this lord of the elements, this universal arbiter, hugs to his bosom notions which stamp his dignity as worthless and turn his autonomy into an absurdity. All his achievements and possessions do not make him bigger. On the contrary, they diminish him, as the fate of the factory worker under the rule of the, quote, just distribution of goods clearly demonstrates. So the depersonalization of being a cog in the machine actually makes, this kind of gets into let me finish that sentence. The depersonalization of being a cog in the machine actually undermines the self-worth of the worker in the situation.
Which is why you either stop being a cog or you become somebody who makes the machines. Those are the only two options.
Right. And so that sounds very Ayn Randian to me.
Oh, interesting.
In some sense, right? Because she's set up this dichotomy between the producers and the collectivists, right? You either get on board with the program or you just break off and make something new. And her argument, of course, is that the people who make something new are the people who actually engineer society in the whole. And if you don't become one of those people, somebody much worse than you might do it. And that's the danger.
And that's, I think, what he's trying to talk about, the psychopaths. It's like, look, you run the risk of being ruled by these people that exist in large margin in society and are willing to do insane things in order to come to power and to pull at the cogs of the machine. And so when you start to see the system closing in around you, the only thing that you can really do is figure out how to operate outside of it in such a way that it's not choking you. And I think that the choice that we have made, because we're not particularly enamored with the like engineering side of things, like the war machine side of things, the like technological side of things, is the philosophical side of things. And the philosophers have always been, I know that there's occasionally...
art, actually.
What's that?
I would go with art. Yeah.
Yeah, art and philosophy.
He talks about art at the end of the book.
Like these are things that have never really received the material rewards that technological and engineered goods do. But I think that you can also be somebody who builds the substrate of the future, and you can be well rewarded for that. You just have to not remain in the churn. You have to individualize, basically, is what I think Jung would say. Whichever direction speaks most clearly to your soul.
I think Jung would believe that if you're a person who has acquired X, Y, and Z skills through your bureaucratic ascendance, that the more that you tune yourself to what the universe wants from you and how you can become at better harmony with the cosmic structure, which is like, seems really mealy-mouthed, but the reality is that you're tuning yourselves to how you want to spend your time in a productive fashion, because all of us have had experiences where the time just seems to zip by when we're doing some kind of work. Everybody's had that. It could be underwater basket weaving, it could be playing music, it could be doing a podcast, but we've had this experience. And I think Jung is trying to say that the more that you spend time in religious contemplation of that reality in your own personal terms, the more that you will be able to orient yourself towards making that your work. And once you've achieved that, then you are no longer just a dehumanized statistical point in somebody's bureaucracy. And you're actually on the road to making a better world, right? Because the bureaucracy is in some sense trying to shape the world. It's obsessed with the world. It could care less about people's psychic experiences. And he's like, no. by paying attention to your psychic experience, you actually will change the world in the long run. And if everybody did that, God only knows what kind of a universe we'd be living in.
I think that one of the places that we should go to from here is an exploration of the formation and stability of states. Like, I'm really curious to know, what is the smallest unit of state that operates really well? And at what point does it become so big and frightening that it can do nothing except for fold people into the bureaucracy? Because all this thought appears in the mid-century, post-World War II. It's people suddenly looking around and being like, oh my God, something weird has happened. And yeah, you had the British Empire, yeah, you had the Roman Empire, but it seems like we had these really long periods of time where states were small and functional and probably didn't have these massive bureaucracies. But I have the feeling that there was some kind of trade-off with well-being and prosperity. Like, states are incredible at making sure that we're rich. Like, we have cars, we have internet, we have cell phones, we have microphones, we have Zoom. Like, all of these things come from empire.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's worth keeping in mind is that 90% of the Roman Empire were farmers and peasants whose writings don't appear in the record. And we have very little idea what life was like for the average Roman citizen. Like, they wouldn't even be called citizens because they weren't part of the assemblies and so forth. But most of the people weren't getting all of those benefits.
Yeah, like we should, and so it's weird because we live in a time where people get most of the benefits. And I feel like it's hard to look at around and not be like, this life is way, way better than it used to be.
Right. And so it is really important that we don't fall to the ridiculous Marxist trap or the anarchist trap of thinking that getting rid of the state is going to somehow solve our problems. Like, that's completely nuts, right?
I mean, libertarian trap, really.
Yeah, exactly. Any of these traps, right? And just like the partisan traps are ridiculous that, hey, if we just get rid of that guy, then all of our problems will be solved. It's like, that's the worst mistake we could make here. This really comes down to an individual quest to align oneself with one's true purpose, which is only evident upon deep meditative reflection with your experience, with your work.
And as an extension of that, I think that it would be cool to study a little bit more about what really highly functional, prosperous states look like.
I mean, I'm pretty stoked. We had this pre-show meeting with this lady this morning who's been working for 50 years on relocalizing economies and getting people to participate not in these global structures, but actually to fixate their local resources in these municipalities on their own well-being locally, and not in how to exist outside of these giant global interstate operations. That's going to be really fascinating.
All right, let's do it.